She was just a little girl with a failing heart, selling wooden toys on a street corner, hoping for a miracle. No one stopped. No one noticed, until Shaquille O'Neal did. What started as a simple act of kindness turned into a life-changing journey of hope, resilience, and a battle against time. Because when a child is fighting for her life, some promises are too big to break. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet suburban street, where 11-year-old Ellie Carter sat on a small wooden stool, carefully arranging a collection of hand-painted wooden toys on an old fold-out table. The display was simple: colorful wooden animals, tiny cars, and delicate figurines, each crafted with care. A handwritten sign taped to the front of the table read, "Handmade toys, help me get my heart surgery." Ellie adjusted the sign, smoothing out the tape with her small, trembling hands. A cool autumn breeze rustled through her wavy blonde hair, making her shiver slightly. She wasn't supposed to be out here in the cold for long. Her mother had made her promise, but promises were hard to keep when time was running out. Inside the tiny two-bedroom house behind her, Ellie's parents, David and Laura Carter, were locked in a whispered conversation, their voices laced with worry. They thought she couldn't hear them. They always did. But through the thin walls, Ellie had become fluent in the sound of quiet despair. "The insurance won't cover it, David." Laura's voice trembled, exhaustion thick in her tone. "The bills are piling up. We're already behind on rent, and her next cardiology appointment is next week." Ellie clutched the hem of her sweater, her stomach tightening. She knew what they were talking about: her heart. She had been born with congenital heart disease, a condition that made simple things, like running, playing, and sometimes even breathing, difficult. The doctors had said she needed surgery soon before her condition worsened beyond repair, but surgeries weren't free, and hope didn't pay hospital bills. David exhaled, his voice lower now. "I'll ask for more shifts. Maybe the manager will let me pick up extra hours." "You're already working double shifts, David. You're exhausted." A long silence followed. Then, in a broken whisper, Laura asked the question that haunted them both. "What if we can't do this? What if—" Ellie didn't need to hear the rest. She knew what her mother was about to say. "What if we lose her?" A lump formed in Ellie's throat, but she forced herself to swallow it down. She couldn't let them see her cry. Not now. Instead, she looked down at the small wooden fox in her hands, the very first toy she had ever made. It had taken weeks to perfect, its tiny paws slightly uneven, the paint a little smudged. But it had been hers, and when she had sold the first one, she had felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. That was the moment she had decided. If her parents couldn't find a way to save her, she would. That's why she sat here every afternoon, selling her handmade toys on the street corner near the local grocery store. She'd watch people come and go, some smiling kindly but walking past, others stopping to admire her work. Every sale felt like a tiny victory, but today had been slow, too slow. Ellie glanced at the small tin can where she kept her earnings. Only $7 today. Nowhere near enough. She sighed, rubbing her chest as a familiar tightness crept in. The doctors called them episodes: shortness of breath, dizziness, moments when her heart worked too hard to keep up. They were happening more often now, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. A shadow fell over her table, snapping her out of her thoughts. She looked up, expecting another customer. Instead, she was met with the towering frame of a man unlike anyone she had ever seen. Broad shoulders, a kind but serious expression, and eyes that studied her table with curiosity. He was massive, easily over 7 feet tall. Ellie had never met him before, but she had seen him on TV: Shaquille O'Neal. Ellie's heart skipped. Whether from excitement or exhaustion, she wasn't sure. Shaq picked up one of the wooden animals, turning it over in his giant hands, inspecting the details. He looked at Ellie, his brows knitting together slightly. "You made these?" She nodded, sitting up a little straighter. "Yes, sir." Shaq's eyes flickered to the sign in front of her, and something changed in his expression. Something deep, something unreadable. A silence stretched between them before he finally spoke again. "Tell me about your heart, kid." Ellie hesitated. Most people either ignored her sign or gave her pitying looks before moving on. But Shaq's question wasn't filled with pity. It was filled with something else. Genuine concern. She glanced at her tin can, the few crumpled bills inside. Then she looked up at him, took a deep breath, and told him the truth. "I need surgery, but my parents can't afford it." Shaq's jaw tightened. His gaze flickered toward the house behind her, where he could see the dim lights of the Carters' small kitchen, shadows of two tired parents pacing inside. When he looked back at Ellie, there was something different in his eyes. And in that moment, Ellie had no idea that everything was about to change. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the Carter family's tiny living room, casting a soft glow over the worn-out couch where David sat, head in his hands. The coffee in his mug had gone cold an hour ago, untouched. Across from him, Laura stared blankly at a stack of unpaid bills, the red past due stamps screaming at her from every envelope. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Ellie's condition was getting worse. Her latest visit to the cardiologist had confirmed what they feared. Her heart was failing faster than expected. The doctor's voice still rang in Laura's ears. "She doesn't have much time. We need to get her into surgery within the next few months or... That word haunted Laura more than anything. The doctor hadn't finished the sentence, but he didn't have to. She knew what came after or... David exhaled shakily and finally broke the silence. "Maybe we could ask for a loan." His voice was hoarse from exhaustion. "I'll take a third job if I have to." Laura flinched. He was already working 16-hour shifts between his two jobs, loading trucks at the warehouse in the morning and scrubbing floors as a janitor at night. The exhaustion was slowly killing him. He barely slept, barely ate, barely lived anymore. And still, it wasn't enough. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "David, we can't take on more debt. We're already drowning." His jaw tightened. He knew she was right. But what was the alternative? Their daughter was slipping away from them. Ellie knew something was wrong. Her parents had always been good at hiding their fear, but she wasn't a little kid anymore. She noticed the dark circles under her dad's eyes, the way her mom's hands trembled when she checked the mail. She noticed the way they avoided talking about her surgery. So she did what she always did. She pretended everything was okay. After school, she dragged her folding table back to the grocery store parking lot, setting up her little display of handmade wooden toys. Business had been slow, too slow. She watched as people walked past without stopping, their gazes flickering toward her sign before quickly looking away. Some smiled apologetically. Others didn't even acknowledge her. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. She was running out of time. Then, as if the universe wanted to punish her further, a sharp pain stabbed through her chest. Ellie gasped, her fingers clutching at her sweater as her vision swam. The world tilted, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Not now. Please, not now. She squeezed her eyes shut, focusing on steadying her breathing. She had learned to push through the episodes. She had to. After a moment, the dizziness passed. Ellie blinked up at the sky, swallowing hard. No one had noticed. Good. She didn't want them to. She reached for one of the wooden fox figurines and forced herself to keep going. Shaquille O'Neal sat in his car, parked across from Ellie's makeshift toy stand, watching in silence. He had come back every day since their first meeting. At first, it was just to check on her. But the more he watched, the more it bothered him. The way she hid her exhaustion. The way people walked past her without stopping. The way she clutched her chest when she thought no one was looking. Shaq knew struggle. He had seen it growing up. He had seen it in the communities he worked with. But there was something about Ellie, something that hit him differently. She wasn't supposed to be out here fighting for her life alone. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel, his thoughts racing. He had to do something. He wasn't sure what yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't walking away. That night, Ellie sat on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The tiny tin can she used for money sat on her nightstand, pathetically light. She had barely made $15 today. $15. Her fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. Even if she worked for the next 5 years, she wouldn't have enough. For the first time, the truth settled deep into her bones. She wasn't going to make it. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to cry. Crying wouldn't change anything. But when she heard her mom's muffled sobs from the next room, she couldn't hold it back anymore. Ellie buried her face into her pillow and let the tears come. Shaq had seen enough. The next morning, he parked in front of Ellie's house and walked up the cracked driveway. He knocked on the door, and when Laura Carter opened it, her eyes widened in shock. "Mr. O'Neal?" Shaq nodded. "We need to talk." She hesitated. "Is something wrong?" "Yeah," Shaq said, his deep voice steady. "Your daughter is trying to save her own life, and I'm not going to let her do it alone." Laura's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Shaq exhaled and met her gaze with quiet determination. "I want to help, and I'm not taking no for an answer." At that moment, the Carter family's world shifted, because everything was about to change. The Saturday afternoon sun blazed down on the grocery store parking lot, its heat radiating off the pavement in shimmering waves. Customers bustled in and out, their shopping carts rattling, their conversations blending into a steady hum of everyday life. At the far end of the lot, tucked near a lamppost, Ellie Carter sat at her small wooden table, her colorful wooden toys neatly arranged in rows. She fidgeted with a tiny wooden elephant, turning it over in her hands before setting it down with a sigh. Business had been slow. Too slow. She watched as people walked by, their gazes flickering toward her sign before looking away. Some gave her polite smiles, but they kept moving. A few days ago, a woman had stopped and asked, "Where are your parents, sweetheart?" Ellie had forced a smile and replied, "At home, working." The woman nodded, bought a small wooden bird, and walked away. But most people didn't stop at all. Ellie's fingers curled into her sweater sleeves, a dull ache settling in her chest. She hated feeling invisible. She hated knowing that, to most people, she was just another kid selling crafts. She wasn't. She was fighting for her life. She just wished someone would see that. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't in a rush. He had spent the morning meeting kids at a local youth basketball camp, signing jerseys, laughing, and giving words of encouragement. It had been a good day. But now, as he walked toward the grocery store entrance, something caught his eye. Or rather, someone. A tiny girl, no older than 11, sitting behind a makeshift table covered in hand-painted wooden toys. Shaq paused, taking in the sight. The girl was small, too small, her frame almost swallowed by the oversized cardigan she wore. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and even from a distance, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. But it was the sign in front of her table that made him stop in his tracks. "Handmade toys, help me get my heart surgery." The words hit Shaq like a punch to the gut. For a moment he just stood there, staring. He had seen a lot in his life: poverty, hardship, struggle. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was the quiet determination in the girl's face. Maybe it was the fact that no one else was stopping. Or maybe, deep down, it was because he had seen this before. He remembered sitting in a hospital room as a kid, watching his aunt, his favorite aunt, hooked up to machines, her laughter fading over time. She had fought hard, but she didn't make it. Shaq shook the memory away and took a deep breath. Then, he walked toward Ellie's table. Ellie noticed him immediately. It was impossible not to. The man was huge, tall, broad, towering over the table like a giant. He wore a simple hoodie and sweatpants, but she recognized him instantly. Shaquille O'Neal. Her mouth went dry. Was he really walking toward her? Shaq stopped in front of her table, his deep brown eyes scanning the wooden toys. He picked up a small wooden fox, turning it over in his massive hands. "You make these?" he asked. Ellie nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Shaq studied the details, the tiny brush strokes, the carefully carved edges. He had seen mass-produced toys before. This wasn't that. This was personal. His gaze flickered to the sign again. Heart surgery. Shaq set the fox down gently. "How much?" Ellie hesitated. $5. Shaq nodded and pulled out his wallet. He handed her a $100 bill. Ellie's eyes widened. I don't have change for that. Shaq shook his head. I don't need change. Ellie just stared at him, stunned. No one had ever given her that much for a toy. No one had ever really seen her. She swallowed hard and finally found her voice. Thank you. Shaq smiled. You're welcome. He hesitated, then leaned down slightly. You mind if I ask about the sign? Ellie glanced at it, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She took a deep breath. She could lie. She could say it was just to help her parents with bills. But something about the way Shaq looked at her, like he actually cared, made her tell the truth. I need surgery. My heart. It doesn't work right. And my parents can't afford it. Shaq's stomach twisted. He had expected something bad, but he hadn't expected that. He glanced toward the house behind her, the chipped paint, the tired curtains in the windows. He had seen families like this before, working hard, doing everything right, but still falling through the cracks. His grip tightened on the wooden fox in his hand. This girl was out here fighting for her own life, alone, and that didn't sit right with him. Shaq exhaled slowly. He could have walked away, could have bought a toy, wished her luck, and gone on with his day. But he wasn't built like that. Instead, he crouched down so he was eye level with Ellie. His voice was calm, steady. Where's your family? Ellie pointed toward the house. Inside. My dad's at work. Shaq nodded. Then he stood and glanced toward the front door. Mind if I talk to your mom? Ellie blinked. Why? Shaq smiled, but this time there was something serious behind it. Because, kid, I think I can help. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. For the first time in a long time, hope flickered in her chest. And she had no idea that her life was about to change forever. The moment Shaquille O'Neal stepped into the Carter family's tiny living room, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving until he made a difference. Laura Carter stood near the kitchen, her arms crossed protectively, while Ellie sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. She was hopeful but hesitant. It was clear from the way she glanced at her mother that she wasn't used to people offering help. Not real help, anyway. David Carter had just gotten home from work. He still had grease stains on his hands from the auto shop, his face drawn with exhaustion. He wasn't one for charity, but when a 7-foot-tall NBA legend showed up at your front door saying he wanted to help your daughter, you listened. Shaq didn't sugarcoat anything. He got straight to the point. I've got connections, I've got resources, and I don't like seeing good people struggle alone. Laura blinked back tears. Mr. O'Neal, we appreciate this more than we can say, but... No buts, Shaq interrupted gently. Let me do this. A long silence filled the room. Then, finally, David exhaled, running a tired hand over his face. Okay, he said quietly. What's the plan? Shaq leaned forward, his voice steady and sure. We're gonna go big, and we're gonna do it fast. Shaq knew from experience that people wanted to help, but they had to be given the opportunity. The next morning, he made a call to an old friend at the local news station. Within hours, a reporter was in Ellie's front yard, filming her story, her battle with congenital heart disease, her handmade toys, and the impossible fight she had been waging alone. The story aired that night, and people started paying attention. Within 24 hours, GoFundMe page was launched. Local businesses donated items for an upcoming fundraiser. Strangers dropped off groceries, medical supplies, and handwritten letters of encouragement at the Carter family's doorstep. For the first time in a long time, Ellie's family wasn't alone. Shaq knew one donation drive wasn't going to cut it. Ellie's surgery and post-operative care would be expensive, so he decided to go bigger. He called in favors, a lot of favors. Within a week, he had secured a basketball arena for a charity game, a massive event. The lineup? NBA legends, music icons, and Hollywood stars. People who wouldn't just show up, but who would make people care. Shaq stood in the middle of that court, looking out at thousands of people who had gathered to support a little girl they had never met. And in the front row, Ellie. She sat in her wheelchair, her body weaker than before, but her eyes bright with hope. But just when things seemed to be coming together, it happened. Sponsors backed out. A major corporate donor, who had promised a 6-figure contribution, suddenly pulled their pledge, claiming unforeseen financial difficulties. It was a gut punch. And worse, it was the night before the event. Shaq sat in the back of the arena, staring at his phone, frustration rolling off him in waves. David Carter sat beside him, his hands balled into fists. "How bad is it?" Shaq exhaled sharply. "We're short about $100,000. David ran a hand through his hair. "We can't let Ellie know. She's so excited." Shaq's jaw tightened. He had seen a lot of losses in his career. Tough games, championship defeats. But this? He wasn't losing this one. Shaq pulled out his phone and hit record. He looked straight into the camera and said, "All right, listen up. We've got a little girl fighting for her life, and we are not going to let her down. So here's the deal. I'll match every single donation made in the next 24 hours. Every single one." He posted it on Instagram, and within minutes the donations started pouring in. Fans, celebrities, people who had never even heard of Ellie before that night. And just like that, the $100,000 gap closed. The next day, the arena was electric. The charity game was unlike anything Ellie had ever seen. Shaq on the court, joking with players, dunking over celebrities, the crowd roaring with excitement. Then, at halftime, the moment arrived. Shaq took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Ellie Carter." The crowd exploded into applause as Ellie was wheeled onto the court. She looked around, her eyes wide, her hands clutching her sweater. She had never seen this many people in one place, and they were all here for her. Shaq knelt beside her, his giant hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Ellie, you've inspired a lot of people, and today," he pulled out a folder, "we made sure your surgery is completely paid for." Ellie gasped. Her mother covered her mouth with her hands. David's shoulders shook with emotion. And then Shaq said something Ellie would never forget. "You don't have to fight alone anymore." Tears spilled down Ellie's cheeks as the crowd erupted into cheers. Laura sobbed into David's chest. And Shaq? He just smiled. Because at that moment, he knew. This was the most important win of his life. That night, as the event wrapped up, Shaq sat with Ellie and her family backstage. She clutched a signed basketball in one hand and one of her wooden toys in the other. She looked up at Shaq. "Why did you do this for me?" Shaq's expression softened. "Because when I was a kid, I lost someone I loved. And I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to help someone else, I would." Ellie's lips trembled. "You kept your promise." Shaq chuckled. "Yeah, kid. I guess I did." And as he watched Ellie laugh for the first time in weeks, he knew one thing for sure. Her future was finally safe. The night before Ellie's surgery, Shaquille O'Neal sat in his car outside the hospital, staring at his phone. Everything had been set. The money had been raised, the surgery scheduled, and the world had rallied behind Ellie's story. The charity game had been a massive success, and for the first time, the Carters had dared to breathe, to believe that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. But then the call came. "Mr. O'Neal, I'm sorry, but there's been a complication." The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Reynolds, Ellie's surgeon. Shaq gripped the steering wheel. "What kind of complication?" The doctor hesitated. "The hospital received notice that the primary donor who pledged the remaining balance has pulled out. As of right now, Ellie's surgery is no longer fully funded." Shaq's entire body tensed. "How much?" A pause. Then, $200,000. Shaq closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. That wasn't pocket change, even for him. But what made his blood run cold was the next thing Dr. Reynolds said. "Ellie's latest test results came back. Her condition is worse than we thought. She needs the surgery first thing in the morning. If we delay..." Another pause. A heavier one. Shaq didn't need him to finish the sentence. He already knew. Without this surgery, Ellie wouldn't make it. Shaq hung up and immediately dialed his financial manager, his agent, and a few close friends. "I need $200,000 in 12 hours. Most people would have thought that was impossible. But Shaq wasn't most people. As his car sped through the city, his mind raced. He had given his word to Ellie, to her parents, to the thousands of people who had supported her journey, and he wasn't about to fail her now. Inside the hospital, Ellie lay in bed, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Her mom sat beside her, running her fingers through her daughter's hair, whispering soft reassurances that she barely believed herself. Ellie was tired, more tired than she had ever been. She could hear the beeping of the monitors, the hushed voices of the nurses checking her vitals. And then the door opened. Shaq walked in. Laura looked up, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Shaq, what's wrong?" Shaq hesitated. He couldn't tell them, not yet. He wouldn't let them feel that fear. Instead, he forced a small smile and sat beside Ellie's bed. "Hey, kid." Ellie's eyelids fluttered open, and when she saw him, she smiled faintly. "You came back." "Always," Shaq said, gently tapping the tip of her nose with his finger. "What, you thought I was going to let you go into surgery without checking in?" Ellie gave a weak chuckle, but it turned into a cough. Her mother quickly grabbed a tissue, dabbing at her lips as her tiny body trembled. Shaq's heart clenched. She didn't have time, and neither did he. Shaq left the hospital room and pulled out his phone. There was only one move left. He opened Instagram Live. The screen flickered to life, and within seconds, thousands of viewers flooded in. Shaq didn't waste time. "Listen up," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "I need your help, right now. We're short $200,000 for Ellie's surgery, and we've got 12 hours to fix that. This little girl has been fighting every single day. Now it's our turn to fight for her." The comment section exploded. Donations started pouring in. Celebrities reposted his live stream. Athletes, actors, musicians, everyone started spreading the word. And then something incredible happened. A notification popped up on Shaq's screen. Anonymous donation, $100,000. Then another, $50,000. Within an hour, the goal was met. And just like that, Ellie's surgery was back on. The next morning, Shaq sat with Laura and David in the waiting room. The hours stretched endlessly. David kept pacing. Laura sat still, her hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles were white. Shaq was quiet, his normally larger-than-life presence subdued. And then, finally, Dr. Reynolds walked in. The three of them stood instantly, their breath catching. The doctor smiled. Ellie's surgery was a success. She's stable. Laura collapsed into David's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Shaq closed his eyes, exhaling deeply before letting out a quiet, "Thank God." Dr. Reynolds placed a hand on Shaq's shoulder. "She's asking for you." When Shaq stepped into Ellie's hospital room, her eyes lit up. She was still hooked up to machines, her body frail, but she was alive. He pulled up a chair beside her and smiled. "Hey, champ." Ellie grinned weakly. "I made it." "Yeah, you did." She reached under her pillow and pulled out something small, a wooden fox, the same one he had bought from her stand weeks ago. "I want you to have this," she whispered. "For good luck." Shaq swallowed hard, blinking back tears. He took the tiny fox, turning it over in his massive hands. "I think it already worked." Ellie's eyes fluttered, exhaustion pulling at her. As she drifted off to sleep, Shaq sat there, holding the small wooden figure, realizing something deep in his heart. He had spent his whole life winning games. But this was the most important victory of all. The first rays of morning light spilled into Ellie's hospital room, painting the sterile walls in soft hues of gold. The steady beeping of the monitors was the only sound filling the space. Ellie lay still, her body weak but steady, her breathing calm for the first time in weeks. She had made it. Outside the door, Shaquille O'Neal stood in the hallway, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes were locked on Ellie's name tag on the door, but his mind was racing through the past 24 hours. The panic, the late-night Instagram plea, the moment the doctor had walked out of the operating room and given him the news that Ellie was going to be okay. He exhaled deeply. Victory. But this wasn't a victory he had won alone. This was Ellie's victory, her parents' victory, the community's victory. And in that moment, Shaq knew something had shifted in him forever. Inside the hospital room, Laura Carter sat at Ellie's bedside, holding her daughter's small hand. David stood beside her, his palm resting protectively on Ellie's forehead. The past few weeks had taken years off their lives, but for the first time, the weight had lifted. Ellie stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Laura gasped, squeezing Ellie's hand. Baby? Ellie blinked up at her, her hazel eyes cloudy with confusion at first. Then she licked her dry lips and whispered the first thing that came to her mind. Did we win? Laura let out a shaky laugh, tears running freely down her face. Yes, sweetheart. We won. David wiped his eyes and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for years. You scared us, kiddo. Ellie gave him a weak smile. Sorry. Laura kissed her forehead. No, honey, don't ever apologize. You're the bravest girl in the world. Just then, a deep, familiar voice filled the room. Well, look who's awake. Ellie's tired eyes widened as Shaq stepped inside. Shaq grinned as he made his way to Ellie's bedside, his massive frame somehow making the small hospital room feel even smaller. How you feeling, champ? He asked, crouching so they were eye level. Ellie swallowed and managed a whisper. Tired. Shaq chuckled. Yeah, well, saving the world takes a lot out of a person. Ellie's lips curled into a small smile. Then she noticed something in Shaq's hands, a small wooden fox. Her wooden fox. Her breath caught in her throat. You kept it? Shaq held it up, turning it over in his massive fingers. Kept it? Kid, this thing is my good luck charm now. She didn't have time. And neither did he. Shaq left the hospital room and pulled out his phone. There was only one move left. He opened Instagram Live. The screen flickered to life, and within seconds, thousands of viewers flooded in. Shaq didn't waste time. Listen up, he said, his voice steady but urgent. I need your help. Right now. We're short $200,000 for Ellie's surgery, and we've got 12 hours to fix that. This little girl has been fighting every single day. Now it's our turn to fight for her. The comment section exploded. Donations started pouring in. Celebrities reposted his live stream. Athletes, actors, musicians. Everyone started spreading the word. And then something incredible happened. A notification popped up on Shaq's screen. Anonymous donation. $100,000. Then another. $50,000. Within an hour, the goal was met. And just like that, Ellie's surgery was back on. The next morning, Shaq sat with Laura and David in the waiting room. The hours stretched endlessly. David kept pacing. Laura sat still, her hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles were white. Shaq was quiet, his normally larger-than-life presence subdued. And then, finally, Dr. Reynolds walked in. The three of them stood instantly, their breath catching. The doctor smiled. Ellie's surgery was a success. She's stable. Laura collapsed into David's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Shaq closed his eyes, exhaling deeply, before letting out a quiet, "Thank God." Dr. Reynolds placed a hand on Shaq's shoulder. "She's asking for you." When Shaq stepped into Ellie's hospital room, her eyes lit up. She was still hooked up to machines, her body frail, but she was alive. He pulled up a chair beside her and smiled. "Hey, champ." Ellie grinned weakly. "I made it." "Yeah, you did." She reached under her pillow and pulled out something small, a wooden fox, the same one he had bought from her stand weeks ago. "I want you to have this," she whispered. "For good luck." Shaq swallowed hard, blinking back tears. He took the tiny fox, turning it over in his massive hands. "I think it already worked." Ellie's eyes fluttered, exhaustion pulling at her. As she drifted off to sleep, Shaq sat there, holding the small wooden figure, realizing something deep in his heart. He had spent his whole life winning games. But this was the most important victory of all. The first rays of morning light spilled into Ellie's hospital room, painting the sterile walls in soft hues of gold. The steady beeping of the monitors was the only sound filling the space. Ellie lay still, her body weak but steady, her breathing calm for the first time in weeks. She had made it. Outside the door, Shaquille O'Neal stood in the hallway, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes were locked on Ellie's name tag on the door, but his mind was racing through the past 24 hours. The panic, the late-night Instagram plea, the moment the doctor had walked out of the operating room and given him the news that Ellie was going to be okay. He exhaled deeply. Victory. But this wasn't a victory he had won alone. This was Ellie's victory. her parents' victory, the community's victory. And in that moment, Shaq knew something had shifted in him forever. Inside the hospital room, Laura Carter sat at Ellie's bedside, holding her daughter's small hand. David stood beside her, his palm resting protectively on Ellie's forehead. The past few weeks had taken years off their lives, but for the first time, the weight had lifted. Ellie stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Laura gasped, squeezing Ellie's hand. "Baby?" Ellie blinked up at her hazel eyes cloudy with confusion at first. Then she licked her dry lips and whispered the first thing that came to her mind. "Did we win?" Laura let out a shaky laugh, tears running freely down her face. "Yeah, sweetheart. We won." David wiped his eyes and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for years. "You scared us, kiddo." Ellie gave him a weak smile. "Sorry." Laura kissed her forehead. "No, honey. Don't ever apologize. You're the bravest girl in the world." Just then, a deep, familiar voice filled the room. "Well, look who's awake." Ellie's tired eyes widened as Shaq stepped inside. Shaq grinned as he made his way to Ellie's bedside, his massive frame somehow making the small hospital room feel even smaller. "How you feeling, champ?" he asked, crouching so they were eye level. Ellie swallowed and managed a whisper. "Tired," Shaq chuckled. "Yeah, well, saving the world takes a lot out of a person." Ellie's lips curled into a small smile. Then she noticed something in Shaq's hands, a small wooden fox. Her wooden fox. Her breath caught in her throat. "You kept it?" Shaq held it up, turning it over in his massive fingers. "Kept it? Kid, this thing is my good luck charm now." Ellie blinked rapidly, her emotions overwhelming her fragile body. She had spent so long fighting just to survive, never expecting that someone would actually care about her story. And yet, sitting before her was a man, a legend, holding a tiny wooden toy like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Shaq leaned in slightly, his deep voice softer now. "You inspired a lot of people, Ellie, me included." Ellie felt the tears slip from the corners of her eyes. She didn't fight them this time. She didn't have to fight anymore. A week later, Ellie was released from the hospital. The Carter family stepped out into the fresh air, breathing in the crisp autumn breeze. It smelled like new beginnings. Waiting outside were dozens of people, neighbors, strangers, friends, cheering and clapping. Signs that read, "Welcome home, Ellie," waved in the air, and the GoFundMe page had now raised more than enough to cover her post-op care. David Carter looked at the sea of support and shook his head in disbelief. He turned to Shaq, his voice thick with emotion. "We don't know how to thank you." Shaq gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "You don't have to. Just take care of your girl." Laura stepped forward, her eyes shining with tears. "We will." Ellie looked around at the crowd, her fingers tracing the scar beneath her sweater. She turned to Shaq. "What do I do now?" Shaq grinned. "Anything you want, kid." She thought about that for a moment, then she nodded. "Then I want to help other kids." 2 months later, Shaq stood in front of a small but bustling toy stand. The sign above it read, "Ellie's Toy Fund, helping kids like me." Ellie, now stronger, sat behind the stand, painting a tiny wooden elephant. The first batch of her new toy collection had already sold out. Shaq picked up a small wooden basketball figurine and examined it. "You know, this one looks kind of familiar." Ellie grinned. "That's Big Shaq. Limited edition." Shaq laughed. "Limited edition, huh? How much?" Ellie tapped her chin. "For you? $50. Shaq chuckled and handed her a $100 bill. Ellie's face scrunched up. "I still don't have change for that." Shaq winked. "I still don't need change." The two shared a knowing smile. Behind them, David and Laura watched their daughter, no longer the frail, scared little girl struggling to survive, but a fighter, a dreamer, a survivor. Shaq placed his large hand on Ellie's shoulder. "You're gonna do big things, kid." Ellie looked up at him, her eyes bright. "I already did." That night, as Shaq sat in his car, he pulled out the wooden fox. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the smooth edges, the tiny brush strokes. One small act of kindness. That's all it took. A little girl, a wooden toy, a life forever changed. Shaq smiled to himself, tucking the fox safely into his pocket. Some victories didn't come with trophies. Some victories came with a heartbeat that kept going. And for Shaq, that was the best win of all. 5 years later. The auditorium was packed. Rows of people filled the seats. Parents, doctors, children, and community members all gathered for a night of celebration and hope. At the front of the stage, Ellie Carter stood tall, her once frail frame now strong, her hazel eyes filled with determination. A microphone was clipped to her dress, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. The screen behind her displayed the logo of her foundation, Ellie's Heart Fund, because every child deserves a chance. She took a deep breath, scanning the crowd before finally speaking. 5 years ago, I was a little girl with a broken heart, not just figuratively, literally. I had congenital heart disease, and without surgery, I wasn't going to make it. She paused, her eyes finding Shaquille O'Neal, seated in the front row, a proud smile on his face. But one person, one incredible person, saw me. He didn't just see a sick kid, he saw my fight. And because of him, because of my family, and because of every single person who believed in me, I'm standing here today, healthy, alive. The audience erupted in applause. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head, amazed at how far she had come. After her surgery, Ellie had spent months in recovery, but she never forgot what it felt like to be the kid who needed a miracle. So, she made a promise: to be the miracle for someone else. At just 16, she started Ellie's Heart Fund, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping children with life-threatening medical conditions get the treatment they needed. She used the same determination she once had when selling wooden toys. Only this time, her goal wasn't just survival. It was changing lives. And Shaq? He was with her every step of the way. "You know you're the boss, right?" he had joked one day while helping her organize a fundraiser. "I just work here." Ellie had laughed, but the truth was, she wouldn't have made it this far without him. He had taught her the power of generosity, and now she was using it to help others. One afternoon, Ellie walked into a hospital room, carrying a small wooden toy. A little boy, no older than 7, looked up at her with wide eyes. He was hooked up to machines, his tiny body looking too small for the bed. His mother sat beside him, her face filled with exhaustion and worry. The same look Ellie's mom used to have. Ellie smiled gently and handed him the wooden toy. "I made this for you," she said softly. "I used to be just like you. And guess what? I got better. And you will too." The boy's face lit up as he clutched the toy in his small hands. "Really?" Ellie nodded. "Really." His mother covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Ellie squeezed her hand. "You're not alone. None of us are." And in that moment, she realized this was the future she had fought for. Not just for herself, but for every child who deserved a second chance. That night, after the charity event, Ellie and Shaq stood outside under the bright city lights. The air was cool, and the distant sound of laughter echoed in the streets. Shaq leaned against his car, arms crossed, watching her with a smirk. "You're kind of a big deal now, you know that?" Ellie laughed. "Took after my mentor." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Mentor? Nah, I'm just the guy who bought a wooden fox once." Ellie reached into her bag and pulled something out. She placed it in his massive hand. A new wooden toy, freshly painted. A tiny figurine of Shaq dunking a basketball. Shaq's mouth fell open, then he let out a booming laugh. "You made this?" Ellie grinned. "Limited edition." Shaq shook his head, his heart swelling with pride. "You know, kid," he said, "if I did one thing right in my life, it was stopping at that toy stand." Ellie's smile softened. "And if I did one thing right, it was never giving up." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them filled with understanding. Finally, Shaq slung an arm around her shoulders, pulling her into a hug. "You changed the world, Ellie." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "No, Shaq. We changed it together." As Shaq drove away that night, he placed the tiny wooden figurine on his dashboard, right next to the old wooden fox. One small act of kindness. That's all it took. And sometimes, that was all the world needed. Ellie's story is a reminder that one small act of kindness can change a life forever. Somewhere out there, another child is waiting for their miracle. Another family is struggling in silence. You have the power to make a difference. Share this story to spread hope. Support a local charity that helps children in need. Be the person who stops, notices, and chooses to help.